Hello, lovely internet strangers. In this video, I'll give you a publishing insider perspective on the Milo Yiannopoulos book deal. There's enough to cover that I've decided to divide this topic into 3 videos. Part 1 will cover relevant background information and the industry responses leading up to the cancellation. Part 2 will cover the cancellation and the industry responses prior to the lawsuit, and also my thoughts on the book itself, which I have read in its entirety. Part 3 will cover the lawsuit and my thoughts on its chances of succeeding. Let me provide some relevant context before we go any further. I am a fan of Milo's. He contributed a great deal to my escape from the cult of feminism as well as leftism, and I believe he is doing the same for many others. I also respect his work in defense of free speech. I hope one day there will no longer be a need for Milo, but for now, I'll take his bad with his good. I wanted to make a video about this because it was close to my heart as a fan of Milo's and as a free speech absolutist, and I feel it's a great way to discuss the publishing industry's ideological possession by the left, which I alluded to in my intro video for this channel. I will say that most of the SJW influence can be found in the young adult, romance, and sci-fi fantasy genres, but the rest of the industry is still largely progressive. Besides the agent who signed Milo, and probably some people who work at the handful of specifically conservative imprints, I don't know if there's anyone else who works in publishing who is a fan of Milo, or at the very least doesn't think his book deal is the worst thing ever. I wouldn't know how to go about finding them without sticking my neck out and burning a lot of bridges. So the news broke on December 29th, 2016 that Milo Yiannopoulos had closed a book deal with Threshold Editions, an imprint of Simon & Schuster, for a reported $250,000. This was during the period between Christmas and New Year's when almost no one in publishing is at work. But in the age of social media, no one really checks out of the news cycle anymore, and that's especially true of publishing. Now, Milo's book deal is what put him on the radar of the publishing industry in terms of formal journalism, but clearly some people in the industry knew who he was already. I haven't taken a survey, but from all the articles I've read and the talk I've heard, I would assume that most people in the industry only read a couple articles about him from leftist news outlets or read whatever narrative was being passed around in some woke Twitter thread. Back when I was a feminist and a big old lefty, I had read a couple articles and written him off. However, by the time the book deal news broke, I had stopped calling myself a feminist and had left the political left, and listening to Milo's talks had in large part contributed to that turn of events. So my reaction to the book news was very different from 99% of my publishing colleagues. In fact, one of my coworkers saw the news about the Milo deal and dramatically sighed, and then started a conversation with another coworker about how shitty it was of Simon & Schuster to give Milo a platform for his hate speech. The first mention of the book deal in the industry publications was an article the next day in Publishers Weekly, which is a weekly trade publication. This article was about the backlash from the deal. They featured a few tweets from publishing professionals and authors. The first was from Saeed Jones, who's a black gay poet with a memoir coming out from Simon & Schuster in 2018. His tweet says, "The publishing industry as of this year is 79% white. Being racist is quite profitable." It's amazing to me that he can make a statement that's the equivalent of, because this is a demographic makeup of the publishing industry, that means that people in publishing are racist. The next tweet was from Karen Hunter, who has her own publishing imprint at Simon & Schuster. She said that she was rethinking her relationship with Simon & Schuster because of the Milo book deal. This tweet is from Joanna Volpe, who's a literary agent at New Leaf Literary, which represents a lot of big YA authors. She said, "No member of the reading community should have to fear they'll be put in danger if their hometown is on his book tour," which is just amazing because, correct me if I'm wrong, there was only one incident where a woman shot a protester outside Milo's talk at UW, and the rest of the violence has come from the people protesting him. Lisa Lucas, the president of the National Book Foundation and a black woman, tweeted, "Outrage helps sell books. Utter silence is what kills them." I thought that was really interesting because that's what I've been saying. If I didn't want Milo's book to do well, then I wouldn't write articles or tweet about it. Milo's been popular on the college circuit, but now the average librarian across the country can pick up Publishers Weekly and read about what's going on, and some people are just going to be curious. Some people actually want to let people speak for themselves and not just accept what someone else tells them. Of course, the CEO of Simon & Schuster stated, "We do not and never have condoned discrimination or hate speech in any form, that they have always published books by a wide range of authors with greatly varying and frequently controversial opinions and appealing to many different audiences of readers." I must make clear that Threshold Editions is just an imprint. For those of you who don't know what an imprint is, a publishing house like Simon & Schuster doesn't just have one guy at the top who makes decisions about all the books that get published. There are different teams that each have a mission to acquire certain types of books, and those people are specialized with the skills and interests to do so effectively. Threshold Editions is a conservative imprint, so they just publish conservative books. They've pretty much had editorial independence, meaning that Simon & Schuster executives don't interfere with their editorial choices unless there are accusations of libel or plagiarism, and that's true of every imprint in Simon & Schuster as far as I know. And Threshold Editions already published Glenn Beck, who leftists have accused of spewing at least as much hate speech as they attribute to Milo. They also published Rush Limbaugh, who appalled progressives and feminists when he called Susan Fluke a prostitute and a feminazi, but neither of their books were canceled. They also talked to some independent booksellers. Kate Rattenborg, owner of Dragonfly Books in Decorah, Iowa, said, "The books my staff and I choose to place on our shelves is a reflection of our community. Our community is not a community of hate, and I will not provide shelf space for a book where the author has risen to notoriety based on his discriminatory harassment, online bullying, and striking fear in others." It's not like these independent booksellers would have carried Milo's book. They were never going to carry that kind of popular nonfiction book, even if it wasn't filled with what his critics are referring to as hate speech. Most indie bookstores, besides The Strand and Powell's, have an incredibly small selection in store. That selection is usually biased toward literary fiction, serious nonfiction, diverse memoirs, and YA. Now, indies generally have a much larger stock available online, and if they sold Milo's book, it would likely only be available online or via special order. In fact, Dragonfly Books, despite the owner's statement, is currently selling Dangerous online, just not on their shelves. Further, they also have books from Ann Coulter and Glenn Beck, people almost equally hated by the left, available for online order. I checked the websites for several indie bookstores, and they also sell Ann Coulter, Glenn Beck, and Milo online, sometimes through special order. So the Chicago Tribune reports on the Chicago Review of Books deciding not to review any Simon & Schuster books in 2017, and Adam Morgan, the editor-in-chief, says that they would just rather use those 15 slots on a different publisher that isn't normalizing hate speech. To give context, the U.S. publishing industry is dominated by what's referred to as the Big Five publishers: Simon & Schuster, HarperCollins, Macmillan, Hachette, and Penguin Random House, which used to be two separate entities. Even if the Chicago Review of Books is covering 15 books from each of those houses, that only accounts for 75 books out of 300 they say they cover each year, so already a lot of the books they're covering must be from small publishers and presses. So it's disingenuous to imply that their boycott is the reason they'll be reviewing more books from small presses. He also says he took into account the people who pointed out the decision is unfair to authors who didn't have a part in the publisher's decision to work with Yiannopoulos. He says, "I don't regret the decision, but it is an imperfect solution." Those people are right. His decision won't hurt Simon & Schuster. It'll hurt those 15 authors that won't be reviewed. The Chicago Review of Books mostly reviews literary fiction. There's a small, picky audience of people that like to read literary fiction, and they trust outlets like the Chicago Review of Books for their opinion. Then Adam Morgan goes on to write a piece in The Guardian, which has an amazing title: "Publishing Milo Yiannopoulos' book is wrong. My magazine is fighting back." He says that, "As the editor-in-chief of a small literary review, I wanted Simon & Schuster to know that broadcasting his rhetoric would have real-world consequences, so I made a decision that has nothing to do with political ideology and everything to do with human rights and decency." Yeah, not covering Simon & Schuster books has everything to do with human rights and decency. It's not purely ideologically driven and ridiculously arbitrary. Milo's book isn't the kind of book they review. Morgan addresses claims that he's being fascist and book burning and suppressing free speech by saying that free speech doesn't protect anyone from repercussions in a free market. I agree, but I would say that the free market deciding would entail Milo publishing a book because some people gave him money to publish the book, and then other people deciding whether they want to take their hard-earned money and buy the book. Whether that's because they agree with some of what he has to say, because they're just curious to see what he has to say, because they want to see the flaws in his arguments, or because they support free speech. Morgan says this is why people are reconsidering their relationships with Simon & Schuster. Of course, it's their prerogative to reconsider their relationship with a publisher because of a business decision that they don't like. But again, Simon & Schuster is still publishing people like Glenn Beck. And I don't see any HarperCollins authors, for example, saying, "Oh, HarperCollins publishes Ann Coulter, I'm going to stop working with them." And they were already publishing those people when these outraged authors closed deals with them. Morgan also says this is why the UK division of Simon & Schuster decided not to publish Milo's book. This unfounded claim was also subtly implied by Publishers Marketplace, an email newsletter that gets sent out to industry professionals only. They note that the smaller Simon & Schuster UK division told the bookseller, which is another industry magazine, that they have no plans to publish the book, which is not news in and of itself. It's a frequent occurrence that the UK branch doesn't want to publish a book, but they make it sound like, "Oh my god, this book is so bad that the UK publisher is protesting by not publishing it." As much as the UK publishing industry also leans left, no one from the UK branch said why they decided not to publish it. I imagine it's because people don't like Milo as much in the UK as compared to the US. When publishers decide whether to acquire a book, they generate a profit and loss statement, or P&L, to project how much they think they could earn and the potential for loss if the book doesn't doesn't do well. They find comparable or comp titles and see how well they've sold to back up their estimates. So they probably ran their P&L and said, we won't make enough money on Milo's book to justify it. I imagine any protest on their part was secondary to profit. Then there's an article in Publishers Weekly about free speech groups defending the Simon & Schuster Yiannopoulos book deal. The National Coalition Against Censorship spoke out in defense of Simon & Schuster after a book deal they made with controversial Breitbart tech editor Milo Yiannopoulos spurred widespread backlash. They said while supporting the right to boycott a book or company for any reason, they argued that to do so risks undermining intellectual freedom and harming readers and writers. I wholeheartedly agree. Of course, anyone is free to boycott a publisher and to stop working with them professionally, but what message does that send? The message is that people aren't welcome in the public square. The message is that people can't be trusted to know hateful ideas when they see them versus ideas that are just provocative. They make a very good point here that, in this case, the calls for boycott stem not from the content of a book, which has not been published, but because of previous statements by the author which critics characterize as hate speech. They say, this kind of response will have a chilling effect on authors and publishers, which is undoubtedly the goal of those who support such boycotts. Fortunately, this position has been endorsed by the Authors Guild, the American Booksellers Association, the Association of American Publishers, and a few other organizations. The executive director says, the ability to think and read freely lies at the heart of our democracy. Endorsing the right to express offensive ideas is not equivalent to endorsing the ideas themselves. Thank you. There are still some sane people left in publishing, though they seem to be in limited supply. The next piece is not from an industry publication, it's from Slate, but they talked to conservative editors in more depth than the publishing industry news outlets did. Slate reported that Milo had been actively shopping his book to various right-wing imprints with minimal success, and that multiple publishing houses told them that they had turned down the book. That's possible. He doesn't really fit in at the other conservative imprints because he's not a traditional conservative. He's also a provocateur, and there are very few conservatives that are intentional provocateurs. And though he's now married, he used to speak out against gay marriage because he saw marriage as domestication. Then they go into an overview of the conservative book business in the US. Regenerate Publishing is the oldest, founded in 1947 and independent. But the conservative imprints at big houses are newer and didn't emerge until the 80s. When Fox News became a big deal, publishing houses saw demand for conservative books. Penguin's conservative imprint is Sentinel. HarperCollins has Broadside Books, Random House has Crown Forum, and Simon & Schuster has Threshold Editions. They talked to someone at Sentinel who said that they didn't reject him for moral reasons, but that his allure as a punk outsider wouldn't really work because his views had become mainstream through the Trump administration. They were also looking for more of a coherent doctrine, and being anti-PC isn't enough of a philosophy for them, which I think is fair. They talked to Adam Bello, who's launching a new imprint for Macmillan, but has worked in the conservative side of publishing for many, many years. Bello said he didn't care that Milo didn't have a philosophy. He's building a new audience for his imprint, which is a political imprint where he intends to publish a wide variety of voices, and he didn't like the tone that launching the imprint with Milo Yiannopoulos would set. Slate spoke to more than half a dozen people who work in publishing, and many asked to talk off the record so as not to risk burning any bridges in the industry. The calculus of publishing Yiannopoulos is not hard to justify, said one editor, if you're just worried about selling a lot of books. I find it incredibly hard to believe that editors would not want to speak on the record about saying something like, the calculus of publishing Yiannopoulos is not hard to justify. Coming out in support of Milo is the controversial opinion. Criticizing Simon & Schuster for just wanting to publish a book that will sell, that's not a controversial opinion. The only bridges they'd be burning would be with people at conservative imprints, maybe, and even then, only Threshold made an offer. Nobody else wanted this book, according to these stories. Publishers Marketplace also asked the very important question, did anyone else actually bid for Milo? They referenced the Slate piece, saying, of course there's no glory or gain now in declaring yourself an underbidder, making reference to the fact that it's unlikely an imprint would come out and say they underbid for Milo's book after the big backlash. Then we move on to a piece in Publishing Perspectives called Free Speech Follow-Up, Publishing Associations Support Simon & Schuster. Publishing Perspectives is another industry publication that has an international focus. They're covering the Milo deal, and they mention the National Coalition Against Censorship statement and say, readers are of course free to criticize any book for any reason. They are likewise free to choose not to read any book that they think contains objectionable material or to urge a boycott. Because other readers may disagree, however, publishers and writers need the freedom to express and disseminate ideas, even if they are controversial and offensive to some. We need not endorse the ideas contained in a book to endorse the right to express them. I like that this piece also states, the suppression of noxious ideas does not defeat them, only vigorous disagreement can counter toxic speech effectively. Shutting down the conversation may temporarily silence disfavored views, but does nothing to prevent them from spreading and resurfacing in other ways. Now we get to possibly my favorite part of the responses, was the protest by Simon & Schuster children's authors. This happened incredibly quickly. 2 weeks after the book deal announcement, more than 160 children's book authors and illustrators signed a letter to the CEO of Simon & Schuster. Amazing. I mean, these aren't even authors whose books are being published on an adult list. These are authors of young adult and middle grade books. I can only imagine they know who Milo is because almost all of these authors are feminists, who consider him enemy number one. I know that Milo has a lot of young fans, so there are some 13 or 14-year-olds who know who he is, but that's likely because they're on YouTube and found his college talks there. They're most likely not going to buy his book. It's mostly adults who want to support him and his cause. The letter itself is just gold. It reads, "We, as Simon & Schuster children's and YA authors and illustrators, have deep respect for our publisher, our editors, and the Simon & Schuster Children's Division, which we believe strives to publish the strongest, most diverse list it can acquire for the betterment of literature and children everywhere. Sadly, we cannot extend the same respect to Simon & Schuster's Threshold imprint following their decision to lend the legitimacy of this publisher's venerable brand to hate-monger Milo Yiannopoulos. Threshold has placed Simon & Schuster's considerable reputation and weight behind one of the most prominent faces of the newly repackaged white supremacist, white nationalist movement and financially supported a man who routinely denigrates, verbally attacks, and directs dangerous internet doxing and hate campaigns against women, minorities, LGBTQ individuals, Muslims, and anyone he chooses to target who supports equality and human decency. Irrespective of the content of this book, by extending a mainstream publication contract, Threshold has chosen to legitimize the reprehensible belief system, these behaviors, and white supremacy itself. I just can't with these people. Why has Milo become the focal point of all hatred to the point that they gotta write a letter to the CEO? It's like he's literally Hitler to these people, even though he's a gay immigrant who's married to a black man. I guess it's because he breaks the narrative of identity politics, and I guess it's because he's popular with young people so he seems dangerous. But there's no attempt to provide evidence of their claims about him. They claim that Milo is a white supremacist, which is not the case. White supremacists hate Milo, especially now that he just married a black man. They also claim that Threshold has associated all of Simon & Schuster with it and therefore weakened the reach of all the other brilliant imprints that daily attempt to contribute to humanity instead of destroy it. Wrong. The only reason this association came about is because of the reaction within the publishing industry. They should have just written a piece saying, Threshold Editions gave Milo a reported $250,000 advance for his forthcoming book. The end! That's what most books get. Most people wouldn't even know that it was Simon & Schuster unless they read the Hollywood Reporter piece and saw the book deal announcement. If they actually buy the book, either they already know who Milo Yiannopoulos is and they were gonna buy it anyway, or they're walking through the bookstore and see it's a New York Times bestseller and they pick it up. And if they do, it's gonna say Threshold Editions on it, not Simon & Schuster. And they're not gonna be like, oh my god, I opened this and it was full of hateful rhetoric. Who published this book so I can hate them? Oh, Simon & Schuster. They say it's not an issue of suppressing free speech, as he already has a broad internet broadcasting platform and the support of many extremist organizations and publications. And they say his voice is a voice of hate that stirs its followers to emotional, verbal, and physical violence directed at anyone that disagrees or speaks to the contrary, insinuating that people who protest this terrible decision wish to suppress free speech is gaslighting. They claim, as Simon & Schuster authors and illustrators who are already published, with books in the release pipeline, with contracts in place, we do not have to quietly accept or assent to this Gleichschaltung, this getting in line with fascism and making it mainstream. The letter concludes, we, the undersigned, pledge to continue to advocate tolerance, acceptance, love, diversity, and equality, and respectfully ask you to take an irrefutable stance against hate. The very next day, a publisher wrote an op-ed in Publishers Weekly called Milo Yiannopoulos and the Slippery Slope of Free Speech. There are no boundaries on inflammatory copy in books. The Supreme Court has ruled that it is allowable under the First Amendment to explain how to build a bomb or murder another human being. According to the same doctrine, books are permitted to promote racism, anti-Semitism, sexism, and false information with complete impunity. He asks, so exactly what is the responsibility of a legitimate book publisher? That is, a company that spends its own money on acquiring, editing, marketing, and selling its titles. That's a question he's been asking himself ever since he read the story about Simon & Schuster giving Breitbart staffer Milo Yiannopoulos $250,000 as an advance for his book on free speech. Ooh, in quotation marks. It's been about 2 weeks at this point since the announcement, but he's just been asking himself every single day. He just can't handle it. I'm sure that the social media savvy editor at Simon & Schuster who shepherded the deal recognized the many financial and public relations benefits of signing up a controversial writer with a large online following. Hell, who wouldn't want to sign the Justin Bieber of the alt-right? Yeah, Book publishers are for-profit companies. They have employees. They have shareholders. Their goal is to make money, not to take moral stances. They didn't think, well, how are people going to feel about this until it could lose them profits? This publisher mentioned a question he'd been asked on a panel that as a publisher, aren't you a gatekeeper who choose only the books you want? And his answer is, yes, that is exactly what publishers are. We use our best judgment to select titles that fit our company's editorial profiles. Another audience member asked, well, isn't that a form of censorship? He replied, certainly, that is one way of looking at it, but as publishers, we do have to sort out the good from the bad. Now, I will come right out and say, no, of course that's not censorship. It's a private company, and they can't publish every book. Publishers pass on plenty of good books, either because they couldn't offer enough money, or because it's too similar to something they're already publishing that season, or because it was pretty good but not great. Just because the right to freedom of expression is a natural right does not mean anyone has the right to be published by a publishing house. He says publishers must rely on our consciences to make our decisions. Yet over the past several decades, the desire to attract attention and make a quick buck has increasingly overtaken conscience. Years ago, I stood in line at a supermarket looking at the bizarre tabloid headlines. I married an alien. Marilyn Monroe's love child found. Ridiculous, I thought, but obviously someone was buying these papers. Camille Paglia and others have talked about this, but people in the US receive a historical education with no sense of scale. But I was a studious English major, and I can tell you flat out, this idea that now publishers are publishing garbage and before everything was literature and now people just try to make a quick buck? No. Go read about Penny Dreadfuls, go read about Grub Street and Alexander Pope's disdain for hack writers. This idea that the publishing world was some kind of moral center for the world that has now been corrupted is ridiculous. It was never that. He goes on to say, we now have a major publishing house paying an author who has a history of writing hate-based articles and using social media in the same way that supermarket tabloids use sensational headlines. I guarantee every single mainstream publisher has published a book by someone that has said things a third-wave feminist or SJW or even just a hardcore progressive would find offensive, and they're not out there every day boycotting those books. They're just making their stand on Milo Hill and planning to die there, I guess. So he says, if we as publishers cannot tell the difference between good and evil, between conscience and profit, between extremist views and the views our founding fathers put forth, we are no better than those tabloids. What would Simon or Schuster think of the fact that their namesake house is playing a major role in legitimizing such an author? We have no idea, because they're not alive. I don't think we know enough about them to predict what they would think about a provocative gay guy who's a British immigrant who criticizes feminism and Black Lives Matter and establishment gays and establishment Republicans, and how they would feel about buying his book. There was another Publishers Weekly piece called 3 Critical Issues Facing Librarians in Trump's America, and Milo was mentioned. The question was, will Yiannopoulos usher in a new genre? The librarian answering the question mentions that Simon & Schuster publishes Donald Trump. They published Donald Trump? And yet Milo Yiannopoulos is what people are getting mad about? Donald Trump is literally Hitler to these people. Unless they stop publishing his books, pull all the copies from the bookstores, prevent Amazon from selling them, then they're just promoting hate speech, right? A librarian wrote this article, and this person was more fair-minded than I expected. They said, will I buy Dangerous, which I should point out no one has yet seen, for my collection? Yes, like most public librarians, I have a collection development policy that riffs on the American Library Association's Library Bill of Rights. Materials should not be excluded because of origin, background, or views, and libraries should provide materials and information presenting all points of view on current and historical issues. The librarian concludes with, it's what comes next that bears watching. If Dangerous is the financial success Simon & Schuster is betting it will be, it will release that bane of the book industry, the copycats. Brace yourselves. While Yiannopoulos may be the first to cash in on his own particular brand of hate, there's plenty more to go around. White nationalists, anti-Semites, haters of homosexuals, Islamophobes, and others. I don't find that there are as many copycats on the nonfiction side of things as there are on the fiction side. And further, who would be the faces behind those copycat books? Maybe it could be Paul Joseph Watson or Gavin McInnes. There's no other Milo. So 10 days later, on January 23rd, Carolyn K. Reedy, the president and CEO of Simon & Schuster, sent out a letter to every Simon & Schuster author, presumably. The letter reads, Dear author, I'm writing to you regarding the controversy surrounding the book Dangerous by Milo Yiannopoulos. Since Threshold Editions announced their plans to publish, we have received comments from you and many of our authors and readers expressing concern and displeasure. It's like they don't understand that they're giving him attention. Milo is trying to rile up the publishing industry, trying to rile up feminists and the leftists in this industry, and they proved his point by being so triggered that the CEO had to respond with a letter basically saying, we've had this controversy and you guys have contacted us and we need to take this seriously. It's a book. It's only one measly book. That's it. Mein Kampf is still published, but no, Milo Yiannopoulos, that's the voice that shouldn't be out there. She says they do not support or condone, nor will we publish hate speech. When Threshold Editions met with Mr. Yiannopoulos, he said that he was interested in writing a book that would be a substantive examination of the issues of political correctness and free speech, issues that are already much discussed and argued and fought over in both mainstream and alternative media and in schools across the country. I also recognize that there may be a genuine debate to be had about who should be awarded a book contract. I don't. Sure, that debate can be had within an editorial imprint as to whether the book fits your mission statement and your list before you offer, but the government shouldn't be involved in telling a publishing house, which is a private business, what kind of books they can acquire. If they make a law like you can't publish hate speech, then we are just on our way to becoming China or Turkey or North Korea when it comes to publishing. People don't seem to appreciate that in America, if you wanted to, you could publish erotica about Trump and Obama, and the worst that happens is nobody buys your book and some angry people leave you 1-star Amazon reviews, but the government's not going to stop you. All these authors are like, we gotta protest, #resistance, but the fact that they feel comfortable advertising on Twitter their #resistance book reading with no fear of jail time or other adverse consequences from the government means they don't need to resist. So a few days later, on January 26th, Roxane Gay withdraws from her Simon & Schuster contract. She's prominent in the publishing industry, especially in the SJW diversity area. Because of Simon & Schuster's deal with Milo, she told BuzzFeed, I can't in good conscience let them publish it while they also publish Milo. Now, she isn't exclusively published by Simon & Schuster, she is also published by Grove Atlantic. She was due to turn in her book later that month and said, I kept thinking about how egregious it is to give someone like Milo a platform for his blunt, inelegant hate and provocation. I just couldn't bring myself to turn the book in. If his hate was more elegant, would it be more acceptable to her? I wonder. She says Milo has every right to say what he wants to say, however distasteful I and many others find it to be. He doesn't have a right to have a book published by a major publisher, but he has, in some bizarre twist of fate, been afforded that privilege. So be it. I'm not interested in doing business with a publisher willing to grant him that privilege. I am also fortunate enough to be in a position to make this decision. I recognize that other writers aren't and understand that completely. It's such an asshole thing to be like, well, because I can afford to pull my book, I'm pulling it because it's this moral duty I have. But you know, if you can't, it's okay. I'll do it for you. Then there was a truly amazing op-ed like a week later by the director of Farrar Straus Hero for Young Readers. In this op-ed, we find out this particular editor didn't know who Milo Yiannopoulos was until they saw on Facebook that a children's author had posted a link to the Hollywood Reporter deal announcement for Milo's book. And that author wrote, Hey Simon & Schuster, this is disgusting. Are you okay with this, Simon & Schuster kids? If you were silent, you were complicit. The Farrar Straus Hero director says, I don't work at Simon & Schuster, but I am the editorial director of FSG Books for Young Readers. I spent some time researching Milo and wondering, am I okay with this? The answer is no. If you look into Milo, you will find out that he was permanently banned from Twitter for leading the charge in a wave of racist abuse targeting African-American actress Leslie Jones. If you look into Milo, you will also find out that he wrote a review of the new Ghostbusters movie that said that it was bad, and he wrote that he felt Leslie Jones was being forced to play a tired black woman stereotype, which he thought was sad, and he also said she was ugly and that she looked enough like a man that he would almost date her. What? No one's allowed to make fun of a celebrity for being ugly anymore? Like, that's offensive? You're only allowed to insult people how? Are you allowed to insult them at all? I mean, yeah, it's not nice, but it's not evil. She says these things are troubling and we can almost write them off, almost, as jokes falling on the deaf ears of liberals. Humor and trolling are, after all, two of Milo's hallmarks, and lack of humor is one of his main critiques of PC liberals like me. We can't take a good joke about rape or about black women looking like apes. You don't have to think that it's funny. No one is obligated to think that any particular joke is funny. Just understand that it's a joke, and therefore its intentions and the effect you should let it have over you is different than a pointed insult. He tells young white American men it's not their fault that they're out of work or that they're struggling. They don't need a college education. The reason they are not succeeding is because of women, people of color, immigrants, and Muslims. From now on, it's not ladies first. It's not people of color first. It's not trans people first. It's white men first. It's America first. Again, she's not quoting anything from Milo, she's just making generalizations, basically equating him to Trump because of his radicalization of the white working class and that he is a terrorist, shouting fire in a crowded theater. That fire is otherness, that which is not white, Christian, and male. The crowded theater is America. Milo's book is sure to be a bestseller, and the men who are going to read it are young, white, and angry. What about the women who are going to read it? Like me. She says, now, hate speech is a slippery thing. One person's hate speech is another person's rape joke. But when an author's brand is racism and misogyny, what can we reasonably expect from his book? His brand is not racism and misogyny. His brand is trolling, if it's anything. She concludes by stating, "I'm from the children's book world, and you may think this shouldn't concern me. I do happen to think that. You are so spot on with that assessment. A children's imprint isn't going to sign Richard Spencer's alt-right bedtime storybook." Please, some troll write Richard Spencer's alt-right bedtime storybook? Then she randomly tacks on, "According to Publishers Weekly's September 2016 Publishing Industry Salary Survey, our industry is 88% white. My guess is that the higher up you go on the management ladder, the whiter and more male things get. I wonder if Milo's book would be published at all if the industry was predominantly run by women of color as opposed to white men. My guess is that it wouldn't." This chick thinks that Dangerous wouldn't be published if the industry was run predominantly by women of color as opposed to white men. I love this so much. She's making the argument that Milo is an offensive white guy, so if there were less white guys at the top, then his book wouldn't be published. Furthermore, if we had predominantly women of color at the top, then his book wouldn't be published. That implies that men of color would be okay with publishing Milo's book because the male privilege bonds them stronger than race. By specifying women of color, she implies if there were only white women at the top, they would give Milo a pass because of his race. So in that case, even though the gender part is bonding you together, you would override that for your race. So it has to be women of color. The intersectionality must take precedence, and then they would not publish it because, well, why would that be the case? It must follow that people like to publish things by people who look like them or have a shared identity. Therefore, the women of color would be like, "Nah, we're not going to publish this offensive white guy. We're just going to publish women of color who are inherently unoffensive. All their opinions are valid. Women of color are never horrible people. That's just how the world worked itself out." So then it makes sense that white men would want to publish books by white men because of the whole "we've got to publish people who look like us" thing. So what's inherently wrong with what they're doing? It's exactly what she implies these women of color will do when they run things. I'm sure the argument would then be that it's different because women of color have been oppressed on a double intersectional axis for all the oppression points, but white men have no disadvantages and white male privilege will just catch them every time. The last piece I'll talk about for this video was published just a few days before Milo's book was canceled. Milo's agent, Thomas Flannery Jr., wrote a piece in Publishers Weekly titled "In Defense of Milo Yiannopoulos' Book." Flannery writes that he's been continually shocked by the willingness of many in the publishing industry to stifle Milo's opinions. I'm not. I'm only surprised that this is the guy they've picked out because I personally expect them to do it to everyone. He says, "To be clear, I do not agree with everything Milo says." I really hate that we're in a place now where everyone feels compelled to say this all the time. Who agrees with everything any one person says? He says he doesn't agree with things that Milo said about the transgender community, but he debates him and says that is what we as purveyors of intellectual thought are supposed to do. Flannery Jr. also says, "I won't stand for it when religious groups try to silence transgender supporters, and I won't stand for it when so-called progressives try to silence conservative voices." I really like this piece because he's saying, hey, I'm still lefty and progressive, but chill out, guys. He says he believes in Milo's core message that political correctness is causing more harm than good, and you may not like what Milo has to say or how he says it, but as a member of the publishing community, you should be extremely cautious of your willingness to shut down a book you haven't even read. Unless, of course, you're scared you might agree with him. Mic drop for Thomas Flannery Jr., please. So that's it for part 1. As I mentioned at the beginning, part 2 will cover the cancellation and my review of Milo's book. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed my insider perspective. I'm happy to answer any questions you have, so leave your comments below, contact me on social media, email me, whatever you like, and stay tuned for part 2.